So I will quickly introduce our second speaker, Uriel Orlow, who lives between London and Lisbon. And his work is research and process-oriented practice, including multidisciplinary media that focus on specific location, emphasizing microhistories, bringing together different picture regimes and narrative styles. Being aware of inherent power and knowledge asymmetries, also within his own artistic collaborations, he deals with remnants of colonialism, spatial manifestation of conflicting memories, the blind spots of representation, and diverse forms of persecution and entanglements with the vegetable world that evoke the spiritual and medicine powers of plants. Uriel Orlow has exhibited his work internationally. I just want to briefly mention some. He exhibited at Venice Biennale, the Manifesta, Sharjah Biennale, Moscow Biennale, Showroom London, Depot Istanbul, and Tabacalera San Sebastian, Al-Mamal Foundation in Jerusalem, and the Kunstmuseum Bern. And more recently, he has participated at the 12th Berlin Biennale, the 5th Mardin Biennale in Turkey, and the 14th Dakar Biennale, all this year. So, Uriel, it's a pleasure to have you here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Liliana, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. Which I have taken quite literal. So I will speak specifically about projects that involved various forms of cooperations with people, but also plants. So it's not necessarily all the most recent work, but it's a kind of selection, trying to think through different modes of collaboration and cooperation. I've been working, as you said, I've been working for a while around trying to think of plants as actors in politics and history. So thinking about entanglements between plants and humans, entanglements across time, and also entanglements across colonial and post-colonial geographies. Some of those projects have led me, for example, to South Africa, where I started to think about indigenous knowledge and medicinal knowledge systems, and what happens when a European knowledge system confronts an African knowledge system. Which is a kind of confrontation that has been going on for a few hundred years and is still going on at the moment with pharmaceuticals trying to identify new active ingredients and then create new medications and trying to patent these without sharing the benefits. And I made a series of films around this as part of Theatrum Botanicum, which are sort of court cases or tribunals. One historical tribunal where an indigenous healer, Mafavuka Nkobo, was accused by the white medical establishment of using European plants in his preparations and thus steering away from tradition. So what would be called stealing from the West. And I kind of restaged this trial and then thought that Mafavuke, the accused from 1940, should come back in the present and organize a people's tribunal thinking about what's going on with the pharmaceutical companies and the bioprospecting that's going on currently. So this is kind of the context from which I suppose I was invited to do a project in Lubumbashi in the Congo for the Biennale of Lubumbashi in 2019. And when I went there first for a kind of research trip, a friend who I knew from before had told me that he had just recovered from malaria, and that it was quite an easy bout of malaria because he was given herbal tea that was extremely effective. So I got interested in this herbal tea and started to try to track down where it was from, where it was produced. And eventually I found out that it's a herbal tea of a plant that is called Artemisia afra, the African Artemisia. Artemisia is a vast family of plants with a lot of active ingredients. It's an African variety of the Artemisia plant that grows more or less from Ethiopia to South Africa. And it's been found to be extremely effective for the treatment and prevention of malaria. However, as I was speaking to people, I said, well, this is a kind of no-brainer. Why isn't everybody using it? So I found out that the World Health Organization is against its use because for a number of reasons. It's quite complicated. The kind of immediate reason, of course, is that the pharmaceutical industry is also one of the sponsors of the World Health Organization, and it subscribes to a kind of to the systems of modern medicine where things have to be measurable. So you can't measure how much of an ingredient you get when you are consuming a herbal tea. Even if you have a spoonful, it's a spoonful, which has been working for hundreds of years, or a kind of handful, but you can't measure exactly the active ingredient. And of course, there's a lot of interest also from the pharmaceutical industry. If everybody could grow their treatment in their back garden, then there would be no need for certain medications. But it's kind of more complicated than that, because there's a kind of longer story of Artemisia, which I quickly have to go into, because it was already used for 2,000 years. A similar Artemisia plant, an Asian Artemisia plant called Artemisia annua, was used by the Chinese against fevers. And in the 70s, during the Vietnam War, it was supplied by the Chinese to the Viet Cong soldiers, who basically suffered much less from malaria than the American soldiers. And after the war, a lot of research was done, and the active ingredient was found, which you can see here. It's called artemisinin. It's a molecule, supposedly the active ingredient. And it was used for the kind of last resort medication against malaria, which uses 3 different ingredients, which is still being used, but is becoming less effective because there is this race between the parasite and the treatment, and the parasite adapts, mutates and adapts and becomes resistant to it. And this resistance, of course, is also connected to the way we use plant medicine, and this goes back to the British having identified the cinchona tree in Peru, which has an active ingredient in its bark that is also effective against malaria, and then transplanting it to India for the whole colonial project. So this form of extraction of something useful from a plant has been going on for a long time, and the extraction itself makes it easier for the parasite to adapt and to mutate, because it only needs to adapt to one thing. So the World Health Organization and certain scientists say that if you use this African variety of Artemisia, it could produce resistance to the medication. However, interestingly, the African plant does not have this active ingredient, but it still works. Nobody knows why. And yet still, it's not allowed to be used. So there aren't any projects that promote it's researchers who have been working at European universities from Congo, but working at European universities who have been conducting lots of trials, have had an extremely hard time to publish their findings. They were attacked locally. So it's a really difficult area. And I found out that there is a cooperative of women an hour south of Lubumbashi in a village called Lumata who grow this plant in a sort of underground way to produce a tea which is then sold, and which the proceeds from the tea is used as a kind of communal health insurance for the women's families. So all the women will give 1 day of the week for this work, and then won't be part of this communal health insurance. So I was interested in their work and what they do, how they operate, and I found out also that still the knowledge of this plant is not very widely spread. So I decided to work with them and to create a garden in Lubumbashi as part of the Biennale, and to grow the plants there, which would also allow people to use the plants, but also to take cuttings and grow it themselves. So we used a plot of land outside the venue, which we started to work on, and eventually started planting. It's a bit difficult to see. Over 6 months, the plants grew. And then when I came back, I collaborated with a sign painter, Musasa, to make a kind of manual on the wall behind the garden that would show how the plant is used. You can see him in action here. And this is the final mural that basically shows the preparation, how long you need to leave the leaves in the water, and how much of it you need to consume. And I also started, through coincidence, I found out that the husbands of these women working in the fields had a sort of music group that was focusing on health issues. And they had already done sort of educational songs around HIV and Ebola. So we worked on a song for malaria and artemisia, which we then performed at the opening, and which exists as a recording that is shown as part of the exhibition. So I'm just going to show a minute of it.
Jeunes étoiles des As, qui vous chantent un très bon produit qui traite actuellement en Afrique, en Europe, en Amérique, la malaria chronique. C'est l'Artemisia afra et l'Artemisia annua qui viennent du Vietnam et de la Chine. C'est une grande histoire, M. Royan pourra vous parler encore. Mais c'est l'orchestre Jeunes Étoiles d'Artemisia qui vous chante maintenant la chanson, la meilleure chanson d'Artemisia, Afra.
Just a brief moment. It's quite a long song, which is quite interesting because it also includes the history. So it talks about the Vietnam War. It kind of creates these translocal connections, which I was quite interested in as well. So it really puts this kind of spot in the context of a much larger global history. This is just an image that shows how the work kind of evolved afterwards. which became this kind of a 3-screen installation, which takes the form of a letter that I'm writing from Lumata. And we see the song. And for me, it was important from the beginning. We had long conversations about what it means for me to turn up there with European funding, doing a project for the Biennale. What is in it for them? So we talked a lot about these questions of privileges and of cooperation, and also of how we could create a sort of circular economy. So this work, we decided from the outset, whenever it would be shown, there would be money that goes back to the community. So there is a kind of honorarium for me, and there is a royalty for them. The work has been shown quite a bit, so quite a bit of money has been generated over time that goes back and supports projects there. For example, here, creating kind of water system in order to water the fields in the dry season. There's also a project of making a new building to treat the plants and dry the plants. This is just another kind of an image of other cultivations that's going on at the moment. And in the exhibition itself, the tea is also present. So the kind of the connection remains constant, and actually we are in touch almost weekly on WhatsApp. We have a sort of WhatsApp group, and we constantly keep in touch. I'm going to move on to another project which I did in London when I started showing some of the work that I did in Africa, especially in South Africa, around medicinal plants. And I started to think about what it means to bring this work here to Europe and to show it, and what medicinal knowledge is around locally. So together with the showroom, who've already had a program called Communal Knowledge, thinking about what knowledge is around in the area, we devised a series of workshops where we met a number of community groups that were sort of living around the area of London where the showroom is based, which is a very mixed area of migrants from various places, from Bangladesh, from Africa, from lots of different countries. So there's a lot of different kinds of knowledge, and we had meetings with a lot of community groups where we started to talk about what they know about plants and treatments of plants from their parents, their grandparents, the kind of traditions of using certain things to treat certain ailments. And over time, we collated a list of about 50 plants, or over 50 plants, from various kind of from lots of different parts of the world, and we decided to use 50 of them and make a garden together opposite the showroom. So we started meeting in an old people's home, which gave us the garden space, and worked with the elderly people, but also the people from the different groups, and also with Carol Wright, a gardener, to seed the plants, and then set up a garden, and which grew. Then we decided to do labels. I had been thinking quite a lot about the naming of plants, and how through the kind of colonial project there was of course an epistemic violence that went hand in hand with it, where plants were named and appropriated into a knowledge system, the Linnaean system of classification of the natural world, which continues up to now. So we decided to make labels that would include names in different languages, and that would focus on the treatments. So you can see it here. Then we also did workshops on how to use the plants. And eventually we wanted to collate this knowledge into a sort of shareable form. So we made a series of booklets called Communal Herbal Knowledge, which focus on different parts of the body and group the plants in relation to different parts of the body. Sort of simple rhizo prints on one side, all the plants, and on the other side there's the usage and the different names. And then I just want to end with a last project, which is a different form of collaboration or cooperation with the Swiss National Park, which I worked on over the last 2 years, thinking about plants and plants in relation to high altitude, and also thinking about plants in relation to climate change. And again, thinking about plant agency, where quite often we think of plants as, or the vegetal world as a backdrop that is immobile, plants don't move. But actually, as it turns out, plants do move. And through climate change, especially, plants have started to move upwards in the Alps. You notice this most clearly in the Alpine region, where the kind of higher areas are getting warmer, and therefore plants are starting to move upwards because new habitats are kind of available to them. So I was working with researchers at the Swiss National Park who did an interesting project which focuses on summit flora, and which started off by trying to collate historical data of plants at the summits of a number of mountains. So looking at which mountains had been climbed in the 19th century, pre-industrialization, and then had been climbed again and again. And we have data of what plants were found at the top like 7 meters usually. And it's basically the easiest way to identify because the top of the mountain stays the same. If you look at what plants are around in a certain spot, it's much harder to identify the same spot again, but you can know the top 7 meters of every mountain. And they found a number of researches where you have data from lots of different times. So we were focusing on 2 peaks in particular, the Piz-Linard and the Gory Horn. And Piz-Linard, for example, is interesting because, as you can see here, maybe, I don't know if you can see it, but in 1835, one single plant was found, one species. In 2011, 16 species were found, and the rise is exponential. So you can basically track exactly through the kind of warming of the climate how many plants move up. So we did a trip together with one of the researchers, Sonja Witt, where we climbed onto one of the peaks that we didn't have recent data, and she did a kind of survey of the top 7 meters, which I documented, and I also made other works like this silk screen that shows the different kind of different moves upwards. I made drawings of all the plants. Sorry, that was a bit fast. And then there is a video installation that shows this work, which I thought was very interesting because it's a kind of collaboration with the plants themselves. It's a very slow work of looking exactly what's around at this altitude, and it shows something that is usually completely invisible, and it tries to produce a different form of representation also of climate change, which usually is the forest fires that we've seen over recent days, the floodings, and this is a very quiet image of quite a drastic change, quite a dramatic change, which results from climate change, but it's a different form of image and it shows violence kind of in a different way. I also worked with the climate stripes that show the different kind of colors that are a kind of scientific representation of the change of temperature in a particular place, and I basically sort of translated them through video into time again, and this is basically what happens. I think I'll leave it here and we can pick things up in the discussion afterwards. Thank you.